it's always wonderful to be able to come out to an event in Corvallis and have a sunny day. So I was really worried that it was going to be a miserable day like it has been this week. So it looks like everything is being very pleasant to us. This is the 8th anniversary of the invasion of Iraq. A month ago, there was another 8th anniversary that sometimes people don't remember as often, but I think is quite spectacular. On February 15th, 2003, I remember gathering together with probably many of you and perhaps about 200 or 300 people on the steps of the courthouse. February 15, 2003 is recorded as one of the largest anti-war demonstrations in human history. Somewhere between 12 and 15 million people gathered together around the war to protest the impending invasion of Iraq. There were folks here in Corvallis, in Portland, in Chicago, New York, LA, Frankfurt, Munich, Paris, London, all around the world. It was quite spectacular. When I tell my students about this event, they go, "Wow, that was really interesting. I didn't hear about it." And then they say, "Well, what good did it really do? The war happened anyways." I remember being here about 3 years ago for the 5th anniversary of the invasion of Iraq. There were about 150 to 200 of us again at the courthouse on a Saturday afternoon. And at that time, what I said was, the reason that we're here today is to bear witness to the efforts of this community here in Corvallis to stand against war. I said that at the time we were there to support one another, to bear witness, to strengthen the solidarity that we had with one another as a community that said, "Not in our name." But let me say this now. I'm starting to listen to my students, and I'm starting to wonder, what does it all matter when we gather together in these ways? Because the wars continue. Just a couple of weeks ago, tens of thousands of people gathered together in protest in the Madison, Wisconsin State Capitol building. And my students looked at this and said, "Wow, that's a lot of people." But what does it matter? The bill passed anyway. And so I'm starting to listen to my students, and I'm starting to wonder as well, what do these marches mean? What do these protests do, if anything at all? It's important to keep hope alive, but I want to say something today that I think is a challenge. I think that these marches and these protests are not enough anymore. It's important to support one another. It's important to be here to talk with one another. But the reality is that the problems that we have in this country and in this world are starting to mount. We are approaching tipping points in the survival of the human race, that if we don't do something now, in 30 years, we will have gone too far, and the death and the misery and the suffering that we see now will be nothing in comparison to what our future generations will experience. We are reaching a period in which war cannot be supported any longer by human beings, or else we will no longer be any human beings on this planet. Martin Luther King, about 44 years ago, said, coming out against the Vietnam War, his claim was that any nation that spends more on military defense and military means than it does on programs of social uplift is approaching spiritual death. That was 44 years ago. There's a great website called nationalpriorities.org you can go to, and you can put in the information of where you live, who your congressional district is, and you can find out what are the costs for different federal programs, including the Department of Defense budget, and then it'll give you the trade-offs. So I was looking at this last night, and I put in Corvallis to see how much we here in Corvallis are paying for the fiscal year budget of the Department of Defense. Here in Corvallis, for fiscal year 2012, the taxpayers in Corvallis will pay $55.3 million to pay for the Department of Defense budget. What are the trade-offs? That same amount of money would have paid for the salaries of 875 elementary school teachers for 1 year. That same amount, $55 million, would have paid for 800 police or sheriff patrols on our streets for 1 year.
That's right.
For that same amount, $55 million would have paid for the salaries of 900 firefighters for 1 year. For that same amount, $55 million, that would have paid for 7,000 veterans receiving VA care for 1 year. For that same amount, we would have 12,000 people being able to receive low-income health care here in Corvallis. And for any students that are here, for the amount of money that we're paying for the Department of Defense budget in 2012, we could have paid for over 7,000 students to receive full university scholarships. For that same amount, 10,000 students could have received Pell Grants of over $5,500 for 1 year. These are the trade-offs that we are paying in order to be fighting in Iraq and Afghanistan, and perhaps now in Libya. We are told that we are going to have to face some sacrifices. We are told that we're going to have to tighten our belts. We're going to have to do more with less all around the country. Hard choices are going to have to be made because our budgets are being stretched. And what you see are the results of this conflict in Madison. Because we're having to tighten our belts, public employees are being stripped of their human rights. In Michigan now, there's talk that because of the budget, there's going to have to be tightening of the belts and the stripping away of local democracy. Have you heard about this going through in Michigan? The Michigan legislature is proposing a bill that says that the governor can appoint various managers who will be in charge of looking over any city or county budgets, city-county governments. And if the managers decide that the budgets of these local governments is too much, they can be dissolved by the managers of the governor. These programs can be slashed unilaterally, and there is no recourse.
That's been passed.
It has been passed, I know. What are we fighting for? What are we looking at? We're looking at assaults on basic human rights, the right to work, the right to have a voice in our local governments, the right to be able to have our institutions that affect our lives have our say in them in designing the policies that affect us. This is what we are facing. It's not just simply a matter of money. Budgets are moral documents. They indicate the priorities of a society. And I think that Dr. Martin Luther King was beginning to realize that the national priorities of this nation were not moral priorities. This is what we're starting to face. This is why I wonder whether coming together once a year to march is sufficient. We are starting to face deep, deep conflicts about the very moral nature of our society. When I talk to my students about these kinds of issues, I usually get a couple of reactions. One of them is anger. How can this happen? Why are people letting this happen? The other reaction I usually get is just a simple sense of being overwhelmed. And this is unfortunate because these two reactions, what happens when people are angry or when they become overwhelmed with all the immensity of the problems that are going on, a lot of people, a lot of my young students become cynical. And they turn off. And they say, well, there's nothing really here for me. And this cynicism is dangerous because what we saw is in the last midterm election, all of these young people that came out to support Barack Obama didn't come back after 2 years. And the results were all of the Republican majorities that are now creating these assaults on basic human rights all around the country. So the cynicism in this society does matter. It matters because it starts to lay waste to the field of struggle, for social justice. We need people to be engaged. We need programs that will bring people together to channel that anger, to channel that cynicism into productive ways of making change for the better. Now, I say all of this, and I don't have any answers. I don't know how to do this. I don't know how this is going to happen. All I can say here is, it needs to happen. We don't have much time. We don't have much time because of the misery and suffering that could possibly increase into the future. But I do take solace in the words of someone who I take to be a very important and wise leader of social justice. And these are the words of Cesar Chavez. 40 years ago, Cesar Chavez finally gave an anti-war speech. This was in May of 1971. And at that point, the speech that he wrote is called, "We Are All Responsible." He took the tack not to say, "not in our name," because he said, we have to realize that violence and what leads to militarism is much more basic. It's much more a part of our lived reality. And we have to figure out what we're going to do on an everyday basis. And so I want to end as an invocation of his words that I hope will sort of inspire the spirit for trying to figure out how we're going to deal with the mounting problems that are leading us to the tipping point of our existence. These are his words. Our opponents are at work every day to crush us, or to get us off target, or to maneuver us with the American public. There is no way to defeat them unless we also work at it every day. Week after week, month after month, year after year if necessary, outlasting the opposition, defeating them with time if necessary. This is what it takes to bring change in America today. Nothing less than organized, disciplined, nonviolent action that goes on every day will challenge the power of the corporations and the generals. The problem is that people have to decide to do it. Individuals have to decide to give their lives over to the struggle for specific and meaningful social change. And as they do that, others will join them, and the young will join them too. If we provide alternatives for our young out of the way we use the energies and resources of our own lives, perhaps fewer and fewer of them will seek their manhood in affluence or in war. Perhaps we can bring the day when children will learn from their earliest days that being fully man and fully woman means to give one's life to the liberation of the brother who suffers. It is up to each one of us. It won't happen unless we decide to use our own lives to show the way. Thank you very much.